Welcome to 7 advanced tips for every Yelan main. As always, it's just me and my set graph, skipping the basics you already have and trying to give you niche details and tips you might not know about a character. For Yelan, we will focus a lot on her burst and how to squeeze in some extra attacks or faster executions. Firstly, let's explain a misconception about her burst. Yelan's coordinated attacks, and actually Xingqiu's as well, are activated by being in the animation of a normal attack, and not by each normal. This might sound confusing, so take a look at this example. Yaemiko can do 3 normal attacks and have 4 or even 5 coordinated attacks from Yelan coming out. This is because Yae's animations, if not cancelled, are pretty slow. And as long as you are in the animation of a normal attack, you will simply get the burst to trigger every 1 second. That's actually really interesting, because it allows characters that are a little bit slower to still consistently trigger these attacks. Unfortunately, it is not really a practical tip, but just a heads up if you ever felt bad driving a team with a very slow normal attacking character. Now you know it doesn't really matter. The consistency is there regardless. And how the burst exactly activates is really important for this next tip. The strength of a character like Yelan also comes from being able to constantly weave attacks to trigger her burst, even if you're just swapping around to set up a rotation or whatnot. A difference that makes Yelan's burst stand out is that it has a faster point of activation when compared to Xingqiu or Thoma. It's almost instant, which allows characters that don't necessarily want to do normal attacks to completely cancel their animations but still trigger her burst. Doing so is referred to as N0, where N1 would be doing 1 normal attack, and N0 would mean cancelling the attack so fast that it does not register a hit but still activates relevant talents. In this case, Yelan's burst. Example, you're switching to Yae just to recast your totems. You could in theory initiate a normal attack and cancel it out with each skill, and do it so fast that it won't even really start. Yelan will activate each time. You're switching to Zhongli for a shield recast? You could do the same. It is of course not a deal breaker, and honestly it's just a bit harder on Xingqiu, but still possible, just not as fast. Also, it's important to note that on some characters, landing that normal attack might be worth it, but otherwise it can lead to faster rotations, consistent damage and hydro application from Yelan. One last example I always like to bring up is Xiao. He has a first normal attack with a very quick animation cancelling time and no heal lag, meaning that an N0 for Xiao is still possibly delivering the first hit of his normal. N1 jump plunge basically takes no extra time, activates Yelan's burst and even gets the hit to land. This same tech cannot be used by Xingqiu or Thoma. They will have to stay in the animation for longer for it to work. And I think we can dive even deeper into this elemental burst. It can be triggered up to 15 times, but this limit can be increased by her elemental skill, which has a unique feature. It activates her burst without triggering the 1 second cooldown that normally applies to each coordinated attack. This means that it allows for additional activations of her burst beyond the standard limit, effectively increasing the total number of times it can be triggered. Knowing this, we can come up with a basic combo of burst, 1 normal, skill, 1 normal. It will enable 3 coordinated attacks very quickly. We can also cheat 1 more coordinated attack, since the skill has 10 seconds of cooldown and can be used twice during a burst, even at C0. This pushes the maximum amount of coordinated attacks to 17. C1 can technically even have 18. But of course, being able to freely swap and spend more time on her comes down to the team, and it's not always an option or worth doing. As you might imagine, it is basically impossible to make a video about Yelan without at least mentioning Xingqiu a few times. So here's a TLDR that you can pause on what Xingqiu and Yelan have to offer each. On top of that, I want to highlight another very interesting case of Xingqiu versus Yelan, and more specifically in VV Vape teams. There are some great upsides in using Yelan, but there is also some downside. The example number 1, and I think the one that changes the damage output by the biggest degree, if not done perfectly, is the difference between a double sword setup with this trio compared to this one. The extra hydro given by Xingqiu's orbitals is both a pro and a con. It's a con when it disrupts your setup or makes you have to press Bennett burst without being in contact with the enemy, and it's a pro when it helps keep the hydro aura up. Yelan's setup is easier and more reliable because you always decide when hydro is applied. Yelan's burst into Bennett burst and a normal attack plus hold skill of Kazuha does the job. Hydro is swirled and buffed, going up, and Pyro is swirled and buffed, going down. Perfect. Of course, Xingqiu can do the same, but it's simply easier to mess up. If you're looking for more information or ways to do it, you can check the Kazu episode. But staying on topic, there is also another difference that both have that is worth talking about, and that's the frequency of Hydro application. Yelan has a special internal cooldown that makes her burst basically apply one hit of Hydro every time it hits. This unit can be used by a Pyro character for up to 2 vaporizes, as it's a reverse reaction. For a character like Arlecchino or Yoimiya, this is totally fine. They won't generally trigger more than 2 vaporizes per second. For characters like Hu Tao, it can instead be a problem. Sustaining one of her best combos, M2C, can be really hard, especially on fast executions or her DOT activating at the wrong time. A shift towards her other great N1C combo is kind of necessary here. But even so, just a Zhongli pillar hitting at the wrong time or anything else that consumes the Hydro aura and you might end up losing it. To avoid these situations, using an extra source of Hydro, even if just an anemo infused burst, makes sure this scenario hardly ever happens. And that's also where the value of Yelan C2 can come into play, with an extra Hydro hit every 1.8 seconds. And since we're talking Constellations, let's also address the value of her C1. 10 out of 10 for exploration, but its benefits in combat are not guaranteed. It enables an even better damage focused combo, burst, normal skill, normal, which is already 5 coordinated attacks. You can technically also use both skills into the burst for energy or mix damage and energy and do one before and one after. And of course, generate more energy for your team, especially with other Hydro teammates. However, in less restricted teams, in which you can switch at will, you effectively only have one extra cast at the start. This is because the cooldown of the skill starts after using it and for one charge at a time. After the first 2, you're using one skill every 10 seconds, just like C0. But if your rotations are longer and you won't be on Yelan for 20 plus seconds, then you will get to cast effectively 2 skills per rotation. Lastly, her Ascension 1 is very simple, and my only tip here is to not overthink your team to maximize it. Even a mono Hydro team will enjoy some extra HP. Ascension 4 instead is a ramping up damage percentage buff that applies to your on-fielder. The longer her burst is active, the higher the damage percentage, peaking at 50% by the end of its duration. You can maximize this buff by using Yelan's burst early in your rotation. This allows it to build up so that by the time your main DPS comes on field, they will take full advantage of it. However, used too early might make the buff expire while your main DPS is still in their damage window. In short, the longer the damage window of your on-fielder, the later you want to cast it in many teams. Like with Sino, for example. You would generally use her burst right before going to him. The shorter your rotation instead, the more you can lean to an early cast. Think about a Raiden national team. You can of course use Yelan after Shanling, but for general Bennett uptime and still a great damage on your Raiden's initial cast, you might prefer opening with it. Also remember that as a damage percentage buff, you cannot snapshot it, similarly to Furina. And now I have a couple of fast tips that don't need too much explanation. Your skill is affected by movement speed buffs, making Yelan even better in exploration or for artifact farming routes. C4 says that for every opponent marked by her skill, you increase the entire party's max HP. And the wording is correct, but you can actually stack it on a single enemy with multiple skill casts. And it's worth noting that this is the only HP buff that you can give to your team in the entire game. And lastly, don't forget about your Breakthrough Barb. It will recharge every 5 seconds not on field and with a chance by using your skill. It can be useful for extra Hydro applications in between your other talents. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Leave a like, comment or sub if this video helped you and stay tuned for more content. I'll see you in the next video.